You really think you can even climb into an Apache old-timer? The voice was sharp, laced with smug contempt, cutting through the heat-shimmering airfield dust. The Arizona sun hammered the Army airfield like a fist of white fire, turning every metal surface into a mirror of heat. Rotor blades stood still across the line, Apache silhouettes resting like sleeping predators under the desert sky. Soldiers moved in crisp lines, voices clipped, boots crunching against sun-baked gravel. Then the air cracked with laughter. Colonel Marcus Hale, tall, polished, and notoriously prideful, stood beside the tarmac with a circle of young aviators. His sunglasses reflected the approaching figure of an elderly man in a faded desert jacket, boots worn smooth by decades of steps. The old veteran walked slowly but not weakly. There was a rhythm to his stride that didn't match the lines on his face. Hale smirked as he spotted him. "Careful around that one," he muttered loudly. He might have flown when helicopters still needed training wheels. The pilot snickered. The veteran didn't flinch. But several soldiers shifted uneasily, sensing something off. Someone noticed the colonel's joke didn't land the way he expected. The heat waves shimmered, distorting the space between the colonel and the old veteran like a mirage. Hale stepped forward, boots landing with an intentional thud, the kind meant to echo authority. The young aviators straightened, trying to look important beside him. "So," Hale called out, loud enough for the entire airfield to hear, "you're the guy maintenance let wander around? This is restricted ground, Grandpa." A few chuckles sparked around him. The old veteran paused near an Apache's shadow, the rotor blades cutting a thin crescent of cool air around him. He lifted his head, just slightly, acknowledging the colonel with a calm nod that wasn't submissive but respectful. "Just visiting," he said softly. "Old memories." Hale scoffed. "Memories? You remember these birds? Son, this aircraft would snap your spine before you figure out where the battery switch is." Some of the soldiers looked down. Even the bold ones sensed the line had crossed into cruelty. A crew chief nearby glanced at the veteran with something like recognition, but he didn't speak, not yet. The veteran simply rested his hand on the Apache's fuselage. His fingers brushed a spot only a very specific kind of pilot would know. A place tied to emergencies. A place new aviators rarely noticed. But Hale didn't catch it. He was too busy performing arrogance. "If you want nostalgia," Hale continued loudly, "maybe try the museum. We'll handle the real aircraft." The veteran's eyes barely narrowed. But one young pilot whispered, "Sir, I don't think he's just anybody." The colonel heard the whisper and his ego flared like a struck match. Colonel Hale pivoted sharply toward the young pilot who dared speak out. His jaw tightened. "You know him?" he demanded. The pilot swallowed. "Not exactly, sir. But I've seen his picture. In an old manual, I think." Hale barked a laugh. "A manual? Son, they don't put retirees in manuals. They put warnings in manuals." He turned back to the veteran. "All right, old man. Let's make this fun. You think you remember these Apaches?" The veteran didn't answer. It wasn't silence of fear, it was silence of choice. And that made it sting more. Hale leaned closer. "Tell you what. Why don't you hop in there and show these boys how you used to fly?" He air-quoted the last word mockingly. The circle of soldiers stiffened. The humor had drained. Now there was something sharper, discomfort. The veteran finally spoke, voice low but steady. "Are you sure that's a good idea, Colonel?" A few soldiers inhaled. That tone, gentle but unafraid, didn't match someone who should be intimidated. Hale's laugh cracked like brittle plastic. "You hear that? He thinks I'm scared he'll embarrass me." "Sir," he said dramatically to the younger pilots, "let's indulge the museum piece." A crew chief stepped forward, quietly. "Colonel, maybe we shouldn't." Hale snapped, "You'll do as ordered." The crew chief backed off, though tension crawled across his expression. The veteran stepped toward the Apache, slow and deliberate. Sunlight flashed over the canopy. The rotor blades above him were motionless, but there was a low hum, a production cue, like memory echoing under the scene. Someone muttered, "Why's he moving like he's been here before?" Hale heard that too. And it made him push harder. "You felt tension like this before. Follow quietly for more." The colonel's pride now demanded a spectacle he couldn't control. The confrontation had drawn attention. From the far end of the airfield, a black SUV rolled toward them, dust curling behind the tires like small storms. The soldiers straightened as it slowed to a stop. Out stepped Brigadier General Aaron Keene, the type of officer whose presence pulled the air tighter. His uniform was immaculate, chest ribbons catching the sun in sharp stripes of authority. "Colonel Hale," he said, tone clipped. Why do I hear a crowd forming around a static Apache on a training day? Hale stiffened. Sir, just a harmless demonstration. Showing the troops how not to overestimate relics. General Keene's eyes shifted to the old veteran standing at the Apache's side. And something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Memory? Shock. He masked it quickly. Sir, Hale continued quickly, this gentleman seems to believe he's qualified to sit in an Apache cockpit. I'm simply letting him try. Keene's gaze sharpened. Is that so? The veteran offered a polite nod. For old time's sake. Keene stared at him for a long, heavy second. The airfield noise seemed to fade, a cinematic silence cue, as if memory pulled the general back somewhere. Then he spoke carefully. Too carefully. Colonel, maybe we should rethink this. Hale forced a laugh. General, he's harmless. Let's have some fun. Keene didn't smile. And the tension shifted unmistakably from casual mockery to something brittle and dangerous. The general knew something the colonel absolutely did not. The general walked closer to the veteran, his eyes narrowing with each step, as though studying the lines on the man's face, the small scar beneath his left eye, and the subtle tension in his knuckles. He spoke quietly. Where'd you serve? The veteran shrugged. Many places. Long time ago. Hale rolled his eyes. Sir, he's probably talking about motor pool duty. But Keene was no longer listening to him. His gaze had dropped to the veteran's hands, specifically the way he touched the Apache's side panel. Not random. Not curious. Exactly. That was proof beat. A gesture known only to pilots who had once mastered the emergency override system in a pre-digital Apache model long retired from active service. A maneuver only 5 pilots had ever executed during a live emergency. Keene stepped even closer. Where'd you learn that grip? He asked quietly. The veteran didn't answer. But the way his hand tightened then released was enough. Hale snorted. General, you can't be serious. He's guessing. Keene ignored him again. His eyes moved to the veteran's left shoulder, where the desert jacket sleeve was slightly frayed. There, barely visible, was the outline of an old patch, removed long ago but unmistakable to someone who knew. Proof beat. The ghost imprint of the 160th SOAR training cadre insignia, a mark belonging to instructors so elite their files weren't public. Keene inhaled sharply. Sir? Hale said, confused. What's going on? The old veteran finally looked up, straight into the general's eyes. And the general's face changed. It wasn't recognition. It was reverence. Hale noticed the shift, and for the first time since this began, uncertainty cracked through his confidence. The colonel sensed his joke was about to collapse beneath him. General Keene stepped back, almost as if giving the veteran space or paying respect. Colonel Hale, he said quietly, do you know who you're speaking to? Hale blinked. A trespassing retiree desperately needing shade? The silence that followed was so sharp it cut the air. The general exhaled slowly. That retiree is Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Rourke. The name meant nothing to Hale. But half the soldiers reacted instantly, eyes widening, breaths catching, and boots shifting as if instinctively straightening at attention. One whispered, no way, that's Ghost Talon? Hale's eyebrows lifted. Ghost what? General Keene's voice lowered. Ghost Talon. The man who saved an entire Ranger battalion when his Apache lost hydraulics over Kandahar. The pilot who completed the impossible spiral landing is still taught at advanced flight school. The one who trained the first generation of deep insert aviation teams. He turned to the veteran. Sir, I thought you were gone. The veteran brushed dust off his sleeve casually. Mostly. Hale felt heat rising under his collar. General, this is ridiculous. That was decades ago. He's... Colonel, Keene cut sharply, how many pilots do you know who can auto-rotate an Apache blind? Hale swallowed. None. Exactly. He invented the technique. A wave of murmurs swept the line. And, Keene added, the reason you even fly Block 2 avionics is because he wrote part of the test doctrine. Hale's face drained. The veteran finally spoke, his first real line of weight. Sir, I'm not here for recognition. Just visiting old metal before I go. That sentence hit harder than any rank. Keene nodded deeply. You're welcome here anytime. Hale's mouth opened, but no words came out. Not apologies. Not excuses. Nothing. The power dynamic had flipped so fast the air seemed to bend. If reveals like this hit you hard, stay close for the next one. The colonel realized too late that humiliation now pointed at him. Colonel Hale stood frozen, the desert heat suddenly unbearable. Sweat rolled beneath his collar as soldiers who once laughed now stared at him with quiet disappointment. The general stepped aside, allowing the veteran to approach the Apache fully. Rourke laid his palm gently on the canopy, his expression softening as a flashback cue washed over the moment, colors muting, and the low hum of imaginary rotors pulsing like memory surfacing. You could almost hear distant radio chatter, faint enough to feel rather than hear. The soldiers sensed it too. Hale tried to regain footing. "Chief Rourke, The veteran lifted a hand. "No need." His voice held neither anger nor triumph. That made it worse. Hale's eyes dropped. "I didn't know." "That's the point, son," the veteran replied. "Respect doesn't require knowing." The words landed like gravel in silence. The young pilot stepped back instinctively, forming a respectful perimeter. The crew chief, who earlier sensed the truth, now stood at rigid attention, jaw tight with emotion. Even the wind seemed to pause, dust settling around their boots. Hale felt something fracture inside, the ego that once held him tall shrinking under the weight of witnessing dignity so strong it made arrogance look childish. The general approached Hale quietly. "What you did wasn't just unprofessional. It was dishonorable." Hale nodded, throat tight. "I know, sir." Rourke didn't look at him again, not out of disdain, but because the moment no longer belonged to pettiness. It belonged to correction. And the entire airfield felt it. The colonel knew consequences were no longer optional. General Keane led Hale a few paces away from the crowd, his voice firm but controlled. "Marcus, I've overlooked your ego for years. But today you crossed a line I cannot defend." Hale kept his eyes on the ground. "Sir, I accept whatever comes." Keane nodded slowly. "Good. Because you will stand down from flight operations effective immediately. And a formal review of conduct will begin today." Hale inhaled sharply, a man used to command, now stripped of his armor. "Yes, sir," he whispered. The general looked back at Rourke. "You embarrassed yourself in front of a man responsible for saving more soldiers than you've ever commanded." The words weren't shouted. That made them harsher. Hale swallowed hard. "Permission to apologize properly, sir?" Keane shook his head. "He doesn't need your apology. You need the lesson." Hale closed his eyes. When they returned to the line, soldiers straightened, the air thick with consequence. Rourke stood where he'd been, hands still resting lightly on the Apache like a man greeting an old friend. Hale didn't approach. He simply nodded from a distance, a silent, humbled acknowledgement. Rourke returned a nod just as quiet. Justice didn't feel loud. It felt complete. But one final moment still waited in the desert silence. Rourke stepped back from the Apache, letting the light fall across the cockpit one last time. His fingers traced the edge of the airframe, gentle, almost nostalgic. General Keane approached. "Leaving already?" Rourke smiled faintly. "Desert's calling. Always liked quiet places." A few soldiers gathered nearby, respectful and silent. The young pilot who'd spoken up earlier took a breath. "Sir, if it's not too forward, what was it like? Flying her for real?" Rourke looked at the Apache not as a machine but as history frozen in steel. "Like holding lightning," he said softly, "and praying you deserved it." The wind picked up, stirring dust around their boots. Rourke turned to leave, pausing just long enough to offer one final line, the legendary sentiment meant to anchor the entire story. "Son, strength isn't in the aircraft you fly. It's in the humility you carry." The words settled like a flag lowering at dusk. As he walked toward the open desert, even the colonel stood straighter, absorbing the lesson he never expected to receive. If this moment hit your chest, share it forward. The veteran left quietly, yet the airfield felt forever changed. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows of rotor blades across the tarmac. The Apache stood still, its silhouette sharp against the glowing sky, a monument to stories most would never hear. Rourke's figure grew smaller as he walked into the desert heat, dust rising behind him in soft spirals. For a moment, just one, the faint echo of rotor hum seemed to follow him, a cinematic cue, or perhaps a memory refusing to fade. General Keane watched with a solemn expression. The colonel lowered his head. And the Arizona wind carried the final silent truth. Legends don't announce themselves. They leave you better than they found you. And somewhere in the desert, a ghost walked on,